Officer Brett Garrett operated under the delusion of invincibility. He perceived his badge not as a symbol of civic duty, but as a personal bulwark against his own biases. To his prejudiced eyes, 12-year-old Triton appeared as an immediate menace, a potential perpetrator, a problem to be swiftly dealt with in a district of affluence. However, when Garrett unleashed his pepper spray, indiscriminately blinding an innocent child, he committed the gravest error of his career. He failed to note the vehicle's license plate parked nearby. He neglected to request the boy's identification, and he was utterly unaware that the man approaching the scene was not merely a concerned parent. This individual was a high-ranking FBI special agent, possessing the authority to utterly dismantle Garrett's existence. This is a narrative of hubris, injustice, and a profoundly fitting retribution. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the meticulously maintained lawns of Willow Creek Park, an expansive green expanse nestled within one of the city's most affluent enclaves. The rhythmic hiss of automated sprinklers created fleeting rainbows above meticulously arranged flower beds. This was the kind of locale where property boundaries were measured in acres, and driveways were lined with luxury German automobiles. Triton Trey Sterling, a slender 12-year-old boy with sharp, perceptive eyes and a reserved disposition, occupied a bench near the tranquil duck pond. He was engaged in no illicit activity, nor was he creating any disturbance. He was simply waiting. His father, David, had pledged to collect him precisely at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, following his nearby piano lesson. However, a recent text message indicated a 10-minute delay due to an ongoing conference call. Trey shifted his backpack. Within it lay his sheet music, a partially consumed granola bar, and his asthma inhaler. The day's elevated pollen count was already making itself known, manifesting as a familiar constriction in his chest, a subtle wheeze serving as a warning to take it easy. A patrol car proceeded at a leisurely pace along the adjacent thoroughfare. The black and white cruiser decelerated to a near standstill as it passed the bench. Behind the wheel sat Officer Brett Garrett, a law enforcement veteran of 15 years, whose disciplinary record stood as testament to his tenure. Garrett subscribed to the philosophy of proactive policing, a convenient euphemism for the harassment of any individual who deviated from his narrowly defined demographic profile of the neighborhood. Perceiving a black boy alone in Willow Creek, Garrett's interpretation bypassed the reality of a child awaiting pickup. Instead, he envisioned a scout. He saw a potential vandal. He perceived someone out of place. The cruiser bumped onto the gravel shoulder. Garrett's door slammed shut as he adjusted his duty belt. He was a physically imposing man, with a closely cropped haircut and sunglasses obscuring his gaze. His gait exuded an unearned confidence, a swagger that proclaimed authority. Trey looked up, his heart lurching. He had received the cautionary directives from his parents. He understood the protocol. Keep your hands visible. Be polite. Do not flee. "You!" Garrett barked, his voice coarse. "What are you doing here?" Trey swallowed, his throat dry. "I'm waiting for my father, sir." "Waiting for your father?" Garrett echoed, his tone laced with unmistakable disbelief. He halted approximately 3 feet from the bench, his hand resting with an unsettling casualness, far too casually, near his holster. "Does your father reside here? Or is he currently engaged in a burglary of one of these residences?" "No, sir. He's coming to pick me up. I just finished my piano lesson." Garrett emitted a derisive snort. "Piano lesson, really? And I'm the tooth fairy. Let me see some identification." "I'm 12. "Sir, I don't have identification. I have my student library card in my bag." "Don't you dare reach for that bag," Garrett bellowed, advancing aggressively. The sudden outburst startled the ducks at the pond, sending them into a chaotic flurry of flight. It also triggered a surge of adrenaline within Trey. The stress immediately impacted his respiratory system. The tightness in his chest escalated into a vice-like grip. He coughed, a dry, rasping sound. "I need my inhaler," Trey gasped, extending a trembling finger toward his backpack. "I have asthma." "I told you to stay still," Garrett roared. He observed the boy's hand moving toward his pocket. In Garrett's prejudiced mind, amplified by years of unchecked bias, he did not recognize a medical emergency. He chose to interpret it as the retrieval of a weapon. Garrett acted without hesitation. He eschewed any attempt at de-escalation. He yanked the canister of heavy-duty pepper spray from his belt. "Sir, please!" Trey wheezed, instinctively raising his hands to shield his face, a universal gesture of surrender. Stop resisting. A concentrated stream of vivid orange chemical irritant erupted from the canister. It struck Trey directly in the face, saturating his eyes, his nose, and his open mouth as he struggled for air. The piercing shriek that erupted from the boy's throat was a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. It was the sound of innocence irrevocably shattered. Trey tumbled from the bench, clawing at his burning eyes, writhing on the grass. The chemical agent exacerbated his already compromised airways. He was not merely blind and in agony, he was suffocating. Garrett stood over him, a smirk of grim satisfaction etched on his face. He activated his radio. Quote, 14 . He made no call for medical assistance. He offered no water. He watched a 12-year-old boy writhe in the dirt, convinced he had just secured the neighborhood. The world was a searing inferno of fire and darkness for Trey. His skin felt as though it were dissolving. Every breath was a desperate struggle. A minuscule intake of air through a straw that burned like a live coal. He felt rough hands grasp his wrists. Quote, 15 . Garrett growled, hauling the boy to his feet by his arm. Trey, unable to see, stumbled, his legs weakened by oxygen deprivation. Quote, 16 . He choked out, tears streaming down his face, mingling with the orange spray. Quote, 17. Garrett retorted, snapping handcuffs onto the boy's slender wrists. The metallic restraints were excessively large. Garrett was forced to cinch them to their tightest setting, pinching the skin. A second patrol car arrived. Officer Miller, a rookie, exited the vehicle. A single glance at the small sobbing boy and Sergeant Garrett's confrontational posture caused him to hesitate. Quote, 18. Miller inquired, surveying the scene. Quote, 19. Quote, 20. Garrett stated with practiced ease. It was a fabrication he had employed numerous times previously. Quote, 21. Miller's gaze fell upon the backpack resting on the bench. He approached and nudged it with his baton. The flap fell open, revealing sheet music for Beethoven's quote, 22, and a blue asthma inhaler that tumbled out. Miller's complexion turned ashen. Sarge, that's an inhaler. Garrett did not even deign to look. Looked like a firearm at the time. Qualified immunity, Miller. Learn it. Embrace it. Now help me get him in the car. They unceremoniously shoved Trey into the rear of the cruiser. The oppressive heat within the vehicle intensified the burning sensation on his skin. He was paralyzed by terror, utterly alone, and convinced he would perish in the back seat. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was one of routine normalcy. To the officers manning the front desk, this was merely another petty offender brought in by Garrett. Garrett was a senior officer, a union representative, and a consistent producer of arrest statistics. No one questioned his actions. They transported Trey to a holding cell. They made no attempt to cleanse his eyes. They deliberately left the chemical agent to continue its corrosive effect, a cruel practice known as marination. Garrett settled at his desk, cracking his knuckles as he began composing the arrest report. His narrative was embellished. Suspect exhibited aggressive behavior. Suspect assumed a defensive posture. Suspect reached for a metallic object concealed in his waistband. He was meticulously crafting a fabricated account intended to safeguard his pension and burden an innocent child with a juvenile record. He felt a sense of power. He felt in control. Then, the telephone at the front desk rang. The desk sergeant, an older man named Higgins, answered it. Precinct 4-2, Sergeant Higgins speaking. Higgins listened intently. His eyes widened. He straightened his posture, even though the caller could not see him. Yes, sir. Yes, we have a juvenile by that name. No, sir, I wasn't aware. Yes, I understand. I will inform the watch commander immediately. Higgins abruptly ended the call and fixed his gaze on Garrett across the room. His face was pale. Garrett! Higgins shouted. Who is the boy in holding? Just some punks, Sterling. Why? Garrett did not look up from his typing. You utter fool, Higgins hissed, striding toward Garrett's desk. Quote, 33. Garrett paused. Quote, 34, Higgins whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Quote, 35. Garrett froze. The cursor on his screen blinked rhythmically. Blink, 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 quote, 36, Higgins continued. Quote, 37, for the first time that day. Officer Brett Garrett experienced a flicker of apprehension, but his ingrained arrogance suppressed it. He was a police officer. He was the law. A federal agent couldn't touch him within his own precinct. Let him come, Garrett grunted, though his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. I followed protocol. The kid reached. It was a clean intervention. You better hope so, Higgins stated, retreating, because from the tone of that man's voice, he's not coming here to post bail for his son. He's coming here to set this place ablaze. Moments later, the heavy double doors of the precinct were flung open. The room fell into an absolute silence. David Sterling entered. He was not attired in a suit. He wore casual clothing, jeans, and a polo shirt, yet he carried himself with the bearing of a warrior. He stood 6'2", with broad shoulders and eyes that blazed with a cold, formidable intelligence. Flanking him were two men in dark suits carrying briefcases. David did not shout. He did not bellow. He scanned the room with the precision of a predator, his gaze locking instantly onto Brett Garrett. The conflict had just commenced. The silence that descended upon the precinct was palpable, the kind of stillness that precedes an eruption. Officer Brett Garrett stood near his desk, his hand instinctively hovering close to his holster, a gesture born of profound insecurity. Across the room stood David Sterling. He did not appear as a distraught parent. He resembled a weapon primed for discharge. Where is he? David's voice was a low baritone rumble, carrying more weight than any shout. Lieutenant O'Malley, the watch commander, a man who had been anticipating his retirement for months and now saw it evaporating, stepped forward. He raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. Quote, 43, quote, 44, David interjected, his eyes never leaving Garrett's face. He produced his badge, its golden sheen reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. I am Special Agent in Charge Sterling, and the two individuals accompanying me are senior agents with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. You are currently detaining a minor in federal custody without legal justification. Now, I will ask you one more time before I have every single person in this room indicted for obstruction of justice. Where is my son? Garrett could not resist. His ego, a fragile construct built upon petty authority and intimidation, compelled him. He stepped away from his desk. Your son is in a holding cell because he assaulted a police officer. I don't care who you are. The law is the law. David slowly turned his head, his gaze meeting Garrett's directly. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. Quote, 47, David repeated. Quote, 48, quote, 49, Garrett lied, his voice amplified, playing to the room. Quote, 50, David stated. He turned to O'Malley. Quote, 51, O'Malley fumbled for the keys, his hands trembling. He led David down the corridor, past the booking areas. The mingled aromas of stale coffee and industrial cleaner were supplanted by the sharp, acrid scent of pepper spray. It still lingered in the air in the vicinity of the back cells. As O'Malley unlocked the heavy steel door, David's carefully constructed composure fractured. Trey was curled into a fetal position on the concrete floor. His face was a swollen, bruised mask of red and purple. Mucus and tears streamed down his chin. He was shivering uncontrollably, his chest heaving in short, shallow gasps. The handcuffs remained fastened, digging into his wrists. "Daddy!" Trey whimpered, alerted by the approaching footsteps. He was unable to open his eyes. "Oh, God," David whispered. The FBI agent receded, leaving only the father. He rushed into the cell, falling to his knees. "I'm here, Trey! I'm here! I can't breathe!" Trey choked out. "It hurts! Everything hurts!" David's gaze fell upon the boy's wrists. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 57. Underscore, 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 quote, underscore 58. Underscore, underscore, he roared, the sound echoing off the concrete walls like a gunshot. O'Malley scrambled to undo the cuffs. The instant Trey's hands were freed, he blindly reached for his father. David pulled him into an embrace, indifferent to the chemical residue transferring to his own clothing. "Get a medic!" David commanded over his shoulder to the DOJ agents. "Now!" Garrett, who had followed them to the doorway, leaned against the frame, arms crossed, attempting to maintain an air of detached indifference. "Paramedics are for injured parties, not suspects. He'll recover." David stood, lifting his 12-year-old son into his arms with the ease of a parent holding a toddler. He turned to face Garrett. David's eyes were glistening with tears, but behind them burned a ferocity capable of consuming the world. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 62, underscore, underscore, David stated, his voice vibrating with suppressed fury. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 63, underscore, underscore, David proceeded past Garrett, carrying his son. As he passed, he leaned in, his voice a low whisper, intended only for Garrett's ears. "You had best pray he makes a full recovery, because if my son suffers permanent damage, I will not only take your badge, I will strip you of your freedom, your pension, and your future. I will pursue you through the legal system until you are destitute and left to rot in a cell," Garrett scoffed, but a bead of perspiration traced a path down his temple. "Is that a threat?" "No," David replied, stepping out into the main bullpen. "That is a federal assurance." 3 days elapsed. Trey remained hospitalized. The chemical burns on his corneas were severe, and the asthma attack had precipitated a complication known as status asthmaticus, necessitating his admission to the ICU for 48 hours. His eyes remained bandaged, and he flinched at sudden loud noises. While David kept vigil by his son's bedside, holding his hand, the machinations of the internal police underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 68 underscore, underscore began to mobilize. At the precinct, Chief Henderson convened a meeting with the police union representative, a shrewd attorney named Stan Kowalski. Kowalski was renowned for his ability to extricate officers with questionable conduct from legal jeopardy. He favored expensive tailored suits and possessed a smile that never reached his eyes. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 69, underscore, underscore, Chief Henderson stated, rubbing his temples. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 70, underscore, 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 quote, underscore 71, underscore, underscore, Kowalski responded, dismissing the concern with a wave of his hand. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 72, underscore, underscore, Kowalski leaned forward. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 73, underscore, 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 quote, underscore 74, underscore, underscore, Henderson interjected. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 75, underscore, 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 quote, underscore 76, underscore, underscore, Kowalski countered. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 77, underscore, underscore, it was a cold, calculated strategy. They commenced leaking anonymous statements to sympathetic local reporters. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 78, underscore, underscore. They were attempting to try the case in the court of public opinion before it ever reached a judicial forum. However, they had committed a critical oversight. They assumed they were the sole observers. David Sterling was not merely occupying a hospital room. He was actively engaged in his work. From his laptop in the ICU waiting area, he was coordinating with his team, yet the pivotal breakthrough did not originate from FBI databases. It emerged from an unexpected source, a grandmother named Martha Abernathy. Martha resided in a substantial colonial-style home directly opposite Willow Creek Park. She customarily spent her afternoons on her second-floor balcony, tending to her geraniums and observing the neighborhood activities. She had witnessed the patrol car's arrival. She had observed Garrett's aggressive demeanor, the very stance he claimed Trey had adopted. Martha was a woman of the old school. Distrusting digital storage, she meticulously recorded events using a physical camcorder, a device she typically employed for documenting bird life. She had inadvertently captured the entirety of the incident on film. She had seen the news reports, the fabrications concerning the aggressive suspect. She had observed the police chief offering equivocal statements on television. Martha was incensed. She placed her camcorder in her handbag, entered a 1998 Buick, and drove, not to the police station, but directly to the hospital. She found David Sterling in the cafeteria, sipping black coffee. She recognized him from the news coverage. Quote, _79 _, she inquired, her voice exhibiting a slight tremor. David looked up, his eyes weary. Quote, _80 _. She placed the camcorder on the table. Quote, _81 _. David took the camera. He opened the small screen and initiated playback. The grainy, yet clear, footage unfolded. It depicted Trey sitting peacefully. It showed Garrett exiting the vehicle like a charging bull. It revealed Trey raising his empty hands and gesturing toward his bag. It captured Garrett spraying a seated child in the face without any provocation. There was no struggle depicted. There was no weapon. There was only unadulterated cruelty. David watched the video 3 times. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the surge of adrenaline experienced by a prosecutor who has just unearthed irrefutable evidence. Quote, _82 _, David stated, his voice thick with emotion. Quote, _83 quote, _84 Martha stated simply. Quote, _85 David Sterling possessed an intimate understanding of the systemic workings of the justice system. If he were to submit this video to the local internal affairs division, it might, by unfortunate coincidence, be corrupted or misplaced. If he presented it to the district attorney, they might postpone its review for months, convening grand juries behind closed doors, while Garrett remained on paid administrative leave. David had no desire for administrative leave. He sought a complete and utter reckoning. He contacted his Department of Justice liaison, Sarah Jenkins, quote, _86 David reported. Quote, _87 quote, _88 Sarah responded. Quote, _89 quote, _90 David stated. Quote, _91 quote, _92 Sarah cautioned. Quote, _93 quote, _94 David declared grimly. Quote, _95 2 hours later, a video titled quote, _96 was uploaded to YouTube, Twitter, and TikTok. It did not merely go viral, it exploded. Within 60 minutes, it garnered 1 million views. Within 4 hours, it had ascended to the #1 trending topic globally. The hashtag #JusticeForTrey began to dominate online discourse. The stark contrast was undeniable. The video depicted a small, terrified boy and a hulking, menacing officer. The audio captured Trey's polite, "Sir, please," and Garrett's enraged roar. It captured the scream that shattered the hearts of millions of parents. Internet sleuths immediately commenced their investigations. Officer Brett Garrett was identified within mere minutes. His online presence, a Facebook profile teeming with controversial memes and angry tirades about quote, _98 and reclaiming the streets, quickly surfaced. Past unresolved complaints also came to light. Details of a homeless individual he had assaulted and a university student he had harassed. By the following morning, the police station found itself under intense scrutiny. It wasn't a riot, but a media frenzy that had descended. Satellite vans from every major news outlet lined the thoroughfare. Hundreds of demonstrators congregated, brandishing placards bearing the likeness of Trey. Inside the precinct, the prevailing attitude shifted abruptly from smugness to sheer panic. Chief Henderson burst into his office, forcefully placing a newspaper on his desk. "Have you seen this?" he demanded. "The mayor is on line 1 demanding my resignation. The governor is questioning our decision to employ a sadist." Stan Kowalski, the union representative, appeared visibly shaken. "We can try to manage the narrative," he suggested. "We can claim the video is doctored. We can say, 'Shut up, Stan,'" Henderson bellowed. "There's no managing this. The FBI is currently conducting a raid on the records division. They're no longer requesting documents. They are confiscating servers." Down the corridor, the double doors burst open with a crash. This time, however, it wasn't just David Sterling. An FBI tactical unit, clad in windbreakers emblazoned with quote, _105 entered. Leading them was the Assistant United States Attorney. They proceeded directly to the break room, where Brett Garrett sat, gazing at the news coverage of himself with an expression of utter disbelief. He still couldn't comprehend the situation. He was the embodiment of the law. How could this possibly be happening to him? "Brett Garrett," the United States Attorney announced, his voice slicing through the clamor. "Please stand." Garrett rose, his coffee cup trembling in his hand. "You can't barge in here," Garrett protested. "I have union protection." "Your union does not possess jurisdiction over federal civil rights violations," the attorney replied coolly. "You are under arrest for deprivation of rights under color of law, falsifying federal records, and perjury. Cuff him." 2 FBI agents approached. Their actions were far from gentle. They spun Garrett around and slammed him against the vending machine. The handcuffs clicked shut, tight and unforgiving. "This is a mistake," Garrett shouted as they marched him away. "I'm a police officer. You can't do this." As they propelled him through the precinct lobby, the entire room fell into an unnerving silence. His colleagues, those who had shielded him for years, averted their gazes. They recognized the sinking ship, and no one wished to go down with it. Outside, the assembled crowd erupted as they saw Garrett in handcuffs. Yet, the most unsettling sight for Garrett wasn't the protesters. It was David Sterling, standing beside a black SUV at the curb. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't holding a sign. He was simply observing. He met Garrett's eyes, then deliberately tapped his wristwatch. "Time's up," he conveyed. Garrett was unceremoniously shoved into the back of the federal vehicle. As the door slammed shut, sealing him within a confinement of his own making, the stark reality finally struck him. He hadn't merely deployed pepper spray against a child, he had inadvertently instigated a conflict with the wrong father, and in doing so, he had forfeited everything. However, the narrative was far from concluded. The apprehension was merely the prelude. The ensuing trial would unearth decades-old secrets the department had diligently concealed, and the retribution destined for Garrett would be of biblical proportions. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago resembled less a temple of justice and more a fortified stronghold under siege. For weeks, the steps leading to the imposing bronze doors had been occupied by a sea of demonstrators, news vehicles, and barricades. The case of the United States versus Brett Garrett had transcended local news. It had become a focal point for a nation weary of unchecked power. Within courtroom 4B, the air was thick, recirculated, and carried the distinct aroma of floor wax mingled with nervous perspiration. Every available seat in the gallery was occupied. On the left sat the quote, 115 a contingent of off-duty officers and union representatives present to support Garrett, although their numbers had noticeably diminished as the proceedings advanced. On the right sat David Sterling, accompanied by his wife and a phalanx of FBI agents who maintained a stoic, silent demeanor. In the eye of this storm sat 12-year-old Trey Sterling. He appeared diminutive in his Sunday attire, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, a conscious effort to quell their trembling. He still wore tinted spectacles. The harsh fluorescent illumination of the courtroom invariably triggered migraines, a lingering consequence of the chemical burns to his corneas. The defense table was a bulwark of expensive leather briefcases and an aura of unshakable arrogance. Presiding over the defense was Richard Blackwood, a legal counsel notoriously nicknamed quote, 116 for his rapacious ability to dismantle witnesses on the stand. He commanded a substantial fee from the police union, and he was undoubtedly earning every penny. Blackwood rose. Adjusting his tailored jacket, he paced before the jury, projecting an air of manufactured compassion. Quote, 117, Blackwood began, his voice as smooth as polished glass. Quote, 118, He allowed the question to linger in the air, a noxious cloud of apprehension. The prosecution was spearheaded by Assistant United States Attorney Veronica Steele. She represented the polar opposite of Blackwood, sharp, direct, and utterly devoid of fear. She possessed no need for manipulation. She had the truth. The trial had endured 2 arduous weeks of character assassination. Blackwood had employed every conceivable tactic. He had subpoenaed Trey's educators in an attempt to portray him as a disruptive child, citing an instance where Trey had been sent to the principal's office for neglecting to complete his homework. He had presented a use-of-force expert who testified for 4 hours, asserting that a backpack could indeed be utilized as a blunt instrument. However, the pivotal turning point occurred on Thursday afternoon when Blackwood committed the grave error of cross-examining Trey. Trey sat in the witness box, exuding a terrifying youthfulness. Quote, 119, Blackwood stated, leaning on the railing. Quote, 120, Quote, 121, Trey whispered. Quote, 122, Quote, 123, Blackwood countered, his voice escalating. Quote, 124, Quote, 125, Steele interjected forcefully. Quote, 126, Blackwood smirked. He turned back to Trey. Quote, 127, Quote, 128, Trey cried out, tears welling and slipping from beneath his glasses. Quote, 129, Quote, 130, Blackwood scoffed. Quote, 131, David Sterling gripped the edge of the bench before him with such force that the wood audibly creaked. His knuckles were stark white. It required every iota of his FBI training to refrain from leaping over the railing and silencing Blackwood permanently. Blackwood resumed his seat, appearing satisfied. He had succeeded in muddying the waters, planting the seed of doubt that Trey was merely a spoiled child responsible for his own predicament. However, Veronica Steele was smiling. It was a cold, predatory smile. Quote, 132, Steele announced. A hush fell over the courtroom as Agent Reynolds took the stand. He was a man who spoke in the language of binary code and absolute certainty. He carried a laptop and a small sealed evidence bag. Quote, 133, Steele continued. Quote, 134, Reynolds adjusted his microphone. Quote, 135, Blackwood shot to his feet. Quote, 136, Steele retorted. Quote, 137, Quote, 138, Reynolds explained, his voice projecting with clarity. Quote, 139, Garrett, who had been leaning back in his chair, suddenly sat bolt upright. His complexion transformed from confident to a ghastly ashen gray in an instant. Quote, 140, Steele stated, turning to address the jury. Quote, 141, She nodded to the bailiff, quote, 142, The screens mounted around the courtroom flickered to life. The resolution was high definition. The courtroom witnessed the scene unfold from Garrett's chest level. They saw Trey, small and terrified. They heard the rustling of the leaves in the trees. They heard Garrett's heavy breathing. Quote, 143. The politeness in Trey's voice pierced the hearts of the jury. Then came the violence, the spray, the scream. The video clearly depicted Trey seated, his hands open, when the chemical agent struck him. There was no lunge, no aggressive stance. It was an act of calculated cruelty, but the true damning evidence emerged subsequently. The video showed Garrett shoving the screaming boy into the cruiser. Garrett then walked around to the driver's side and entered the vehicle. Believing himself to be in the clear, he reached up and tapped the camera. He thought he had turned it off. The video feed went black, but the audio persisted. The courtroom was enveloped in an absolute silence, so profound that a pin drop would have been audible, the sound of a car door slamming, the click of a seatbelt fastening. Then, the distinct sound of a phone being dialed. Quote, 144, Garrett's voice came through the speakers. Casual, even bored. I need you to handle something for me. I just blinded some little smart aleck in the park. Yeah, looks like a rich kid. I need a resisting charge. Maybe assault on an officer. Make it look like he initiated it. I'm going to delete the cam footage now. Just cover me on the paperwork. All right. Yeah, teach him a lesson about respect. A dry, soulless chuckle echoed through the speakers. The recording ended. For 3 seconds, no one moved. The sheer horror of it hung in the air like a tangible weight. The jury members looked at Brett Garrett, not as a law enforcement officer, but as a monster. Richard Blackwood closed his folder, his gaze fixed on the table, avoiding eye contact with his client. He understood his career had just suffered a catastrophic blow. There was no plausible defense for this. There was no way to spin a confession of a frame-up. Veronica Steele turned to the jury, her eyes blazing. He didn't just injure a child because he felt threatened, she declared, her voice quivering with controlled fury. He did it because he reveled in it. And then he exploited his badge to attempt to bury the truth. The prosecution rests. David Sterling met Garrett's gaze across the aisle. Garrett averted his eyes, shrinking into his suit, realizing that the protective quote, 148 he had relied upon for 15 years had just collapsed upon him. The hunter had become the hunted. The jury had deliberated for 3 days. In cinematic portrayals, suspense is typically condensed into a few dramatic moments, but in reality, it was 72 hours of agonizing purgatory. For David and Sarah Sterling, every tick of the heavy oak clock in the hallway felt like an hour. David paced the marble corridor outside courtroom 4B, his footsteps creating a rhythmic click against the stone. He was a man accustomed to command, to orchestrating operations, directing agents, and managing crises. Yet here, he was utterly powerless. He was simply a father, anxiously awaiting to ascertain if the very system he had dedicated his life to would ultimately deliver justice for his son. Inside the witness waiting room, Trey sat in quiet contemplation. He wasn't engrossed in his phone. Instead, he was tracing the faint scars on his wrists where the handcuffs had once dug in. They were barely visible now, thin white lines. But to Trey, they felt like heavy chains that had not yet entirely detached. "David," Sarah said softly, her hand resting on his arm, "stop pacing. You'll wear a hole in the floor." "If they acquit him," David murmured, his voice low and laced with menace, "if they buy that split-second decision fabrication after witnessing that video." "They won't," Sarah reassured him, though her eyes betrayed her own deep-seated fear. They saw the truth. At 2:15 in the afternoon, on a Tuesday, the bailiff opened the double doors. "The jury has reached a verdict." The air in the courtroom seemed to vanish instantaneously, a palpable vacuum of anticipation. The gallery was filled to capacity. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. The demonstrators outside fell silent, pressing their ears against the building's glass facade, as if they could somehow hear through the solid walls. Officer Brett Garrett was escorted in. He appeared haggard. The preceding weeks had stripped away the arrogance that had defined him. Without his uniform, without his weapon, and without the unwavering support of his department, he was merely a middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit, confronting the precipice of his own downfall. Judge Hargrave entered, his black robes billowing dramatically. He took his seat, his expression inscrutable. Quote, 156, the 12 jurors filed in. They did not look towards the defense table. This was the initial indicator. In David's extensive experience, if a jury's gaze rested on the defendant, an acquittal was imminent. If their eyes were directed towards the judge or the floor, a conviction was likely. These jurors' eyes were fixed on the floor. Quote, 157, Judge Hargrave stated. Quote, 158, the foreman, a mechanic with grease-stained cuticles who had listened with unwavering attention throughout the proceedings, stood. He held the verdict sheet with both hands, a clear attempt to steady its trembling. Quote, 159, the foreman cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the hushed room. Quote, 160, quote, 161, A collective gasp escaped the gallery. Followed by a sob from Sarah, David closed his eyes, his head bowing slightly. Quote, 162, quote, 163, quote, 164, quote, 165, quote, 166, quote, 167, It was a complete victory. Every falsehood, every cover-up, every act of brutality was met with a single, condemnatory word. Garrett initially showed no reaction. It was as if he were incapable of comprehending the pronouncements. He blinked rapidly, glancing towards his attorney, Richard Blackwood. Blackwood stared straight ahead, already mentally strategizing how to extricate himself from the unfolding disaster. Quote, 168, Judge Hargrave declared. He then directed his gaze towards Garrett. It was a chilling, unnerving stare. Quote, 169, The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut on Garrett's wrists was the most gratifying sound David Sterling had ever heard. It was the identical sound Garrett had inflicted upon Trey. But this time, it was the sound of justice. Garrett panicked. Wait, no, I was just doing my job. You can't put me in there with them. I'm a police officer. You were a police officer, the marshal stated, pushing him towards the side door. Now you're just inmate number 8,940. 2 months later, the courtroom reconvened for the sentencing phase. This was the moment of ultimate consequence. The guilty verdict had been the initial blow. The sentence would be the knockout. Under federal sentencing guidelines, Garrett faced a minimum of 10 years imprisonment. However, the prosecution was advocating for a significantly harsher penalty. David Sterling stood to deliver his victim impact statement. He approached the podium, placing a single photograph on the stand. It was not an image of Trey's injuries. Instead, it depicted Trey playing the piano at a recital 2 years prior, a picture of happiness, lightness, and freedom. Quote, 173, David began. His voice steady but underscored with steely resolve. Quote, 174, David turned to face Garrett. Quote, 175, David paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. Quote, 176, When it was Garrett's turn to speak, he mumbled a half-hearted apology, reading from a document prepared by Blackwood. I regret the events that transpired. Things became out of hand. I never intended for the boy to be harmed. Judge Hargrave remained unconvinced. He peered over his spectacles, his expression radiating utter disdain. "Mr. Garrett," the judge declared, his voice resonating throughout the chamber, "in my 20 years on the bench, I have presided over cases involving murderers, cartel leaders, and terrorists. However, nothing fills me with greater revulsion than a man who hides behind a badge to victimize the vulnerable. You are a bully, and worse, you are a coward." The judge leaned forward. "You have requested not to be placed in the general population, citing concerns for your safety as a former officer. You desire special protection. You expect the system to coddle you," Judge Hargrave continued. "The profound irony is that you denied a child his safety when he was under your custody. Nevertheless, the Federal Bureau of Prisons will ensure your survival, if only so that you may serve every single day of your sentence. Brett Garrett, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison. There is no parole in the federal system. You will serve 85% of your time before you are even eligible for supervised release. You will be an elderly man when you once again experience the freedom of the open sky. Remove him from my sight." The gavel struck the block with a resounding thud, sounding like a thunderclap sealing a tomb. The transfer to USP Florence, a maximum security federal penitentiary, proved to be a brutal awakening. Garrett was stripped of his tailored suit. He was stripped of his name. He was issued an orange jumpsuit that carried the pungent odor of industrial detergent and the sweat of other men. He was placed in protective custody, but within the confines of a prison, that is a relative concept. It meant he was housed in a wing with other disgraced officers, informants, and high-profile targets. It was a solitary, paranoid existence. During his first week inside, he was assigned the demeaning task of mopping the floors of the cell block. A group of inmates walked by on the opposite side of the bars. They recognized him from the news coverage. "Hey, Officer Friendly," one of them shouted. "Where's your pepper spray now?" Garrett kept his head down, his grip tightening on the mop handle. "You blinded a kid, man," another inmate spat. "Even in here we have standards. You're trash, Garrett. You're the bottom of the barrel." That night, lying on a thin mattress that offered no solace, listening to the screams and the clanging of metal that permeated the prison air, Brett Garrett finally wept. He realized that David Sterling had kept his solemn promise. He hadn't merely taken his job, he had extinguished his life. The power he had so fervently worshipped was gone, and the fear he had inflicted upon others was now his sole companion. While Garrett languished in a 6-by-8-foot cell, the world outside underwent a profound transformation. The video footage of Trey had ignited an unquenchable firestorm. David Sterling did not return to the status quo. He leveraged his influence, his connections, and the sheer force of public indignation to champion reform. He collaborated with senators and civil rights advocates to draft the Sterling-Garrett Act, colloquially known as the Garrett Law. This legislation was groundbreaking. The legislation enacted carried significant provisions. Firstly, any interference with a body-worn camera was designated a federal felony, carrying a mandatory minimum prison sentence. Secondly, the concept of qualified immunity could be challenged and overturned in instances of clear and intentional constitutional rights violations. Thirdly, a national registry was established, cataloging instances of police misconduct, thereby preventing errant officers from simply relocating to a different jurisdiction. 6 months subsequent to the conclusion of the trial, David found himself standing on the hallowed grounds of the White House Rose Garden. He observed as the president officially signed the landmark bill into law. His expression was not one of outward joy for the assembled press. Instead, his gaze was fixed upon Trey, who stood by his side. Quote, 186, David murmured to his son, quote, 187, a full year elapsed, and the Willow Creek Community Center was thronged with attendees. The atmosphere was perfumed with the scent of polished wood and fine fragrances. It marked the evening of the regional youth piano competition. Trey Sterling stood backstage, meticulously straightening his tie. He was 13 years of age now, noticeably taller, with a more developed frame. He still carried an inhaler in his pocket. But the compulsive need to check it every 5 minutes had subsided. His eyes had largely healed. He wore spectacles, which lent him an air of studious intellect. The visible scars had faded, but the internal echoes remained. For a considerable period, the very thought of approaching the piano had been unbearable. The melodies conjured painful recollections of that fateful day in the park, the scattered sheet music strewn across the grass, the sheer pandemonium. However, David had persistently encouraged him not to surrender. Quote, 188, he had impressed upon him. Quote, 189, Consequently, Trey persevered. He played through the pervasive fear. He played through the consuming anger. Quote, 190, boomed the announcer's voice. Performing Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. Please give a warm welcome to Triton Sterling. Trey stepped onto the stage, the intense glare of the spotlight momentarily blinding him. For an infinitesimal fraction of a second, his heart pounded erratically. The searing brightness brought back the vivid memory of the blazing orange spray. He became paralyzed. The assembled audience fell into a hushed silence. In the foremost row, David leaned forward, his own heart leaping into his throat. Breathe, son. Just breathe. Trey closed his eyes. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs. He was no longer in the park. He was on this stage. He was secure. He was resolute. He approached the Steinway. He lifted his hands and brought them down with a resonant, powerful impact. The Prelude is a composition characterized by its dark, somber, and foreboding tone, evoking themes of struggle and the tolling of bells. It was an exquisitely fitting selection. Trey channeled his entire being into the keys. The accumulated anger, the profound fear, the palpable injustice, he transmuted it all into the music. His fingers danced across the ivory, executing the notes with a dexterity and force that belied his years. The music ascended, filling the vast auditorium, an insistent demand to be acknowledged. It was an unequivocal declaration of survival. As he struck the final reverberating chords, allowing them to resonate into the subsequent stillness, Trey opened his eyes. He saw his father. David was openly weeping, a smile of profound pride radiating through his tears. Beside him, Sarah applauded with such vigor that her hands began to ache. The audience's reaction transcended mere applause. It was an ovation. They rose to their feet, a tidal wave of appreciation engulfing the young man who had been shattered and had painstakingly reconstructed himself. Trey rose and offered a bow. He looked down at his hands, the very hands that Garrett had manacled, the hands that were intended to be instruments of harm. They were not weapons, they were conduits of beauty. In that pivotal instant, Trey understood with absolute certainty that he would indeed be all right. The harrowing ordeal had concluded. The perpetrator was incarcerated. And the music was merely the nascent stage of his future. What an extraordinary journey. From the depths of depravity to the pinnacles of justice, Brett Garrett had falsely believed himself to be above the law. However, he discovered in the most definitive manner that truth reigns as the ultimate sovereign. He is currently confined to a cell because a father refused to yield and a community refused to remain indifferent. Yet, the true protagonist in this narrative is not the federal agent or the legal counsel. It is Trey. He transmuted the most devastating experience of his life into the catalyst for his own burgeoning strength. This, undeniably, is the very essence of resilience. If this account has resonated with you, and you firmly believe that justice should be impartial, irrespective of background or power, please actively engage with the like button. Your participation amplifies our ability to share these narratives with a wider audience. Kindly disseminate this video to your acquaintances and family members. Let us collectively ensure that the principle of accountability for wrongful actions is universally understood. And if you have not yet done so, please subscribe and activate the notification bell. We have a wealth of additional stories celebrating poetic justice on the horizon. Thank you for viewing. Exercise kindness towards one another, but exhibit zero tolerance for malfeasance. We anticipate your presence in our next presentation.